Alright, so hello everyone and welcome back to another Fandeck Showcase. Like I said, there will be probably one every day now, if not a bit more, depending on how many I actually want to cover. But this one was definitely on my list from the start. I wanted to start with a pretty basic deck with Itachi yesterday. So let's get into a bit more spicy stuff, right? So we have a deck about HP Lovecraft, who you might know from uh, many different games with his Cthulhu stuff. He's an insanely interesting person with insanely interesting works to cover. He is, in my case, a melee fighter with 16 health, move 2, and he has 3 1 health sidekicks, being the Formless Shadows. So, let's look at his ability. It is Lovecraft starts the game with 5 Psyche. You have a max of 5 Psyche. At the end of your turn, if you didn't attack on this turn, lose 1 Psyche. If your Psyche reaches 0, discard a random card and take damage equal to its boost value. Okay, so that's an interesting ability. From the get-go, we know, okay, we have something to do with resource management. It's quite similar to maybe someone like Ghost Rider or Beowulf or Tesla. You have a resource that you have to manage that will probably be depleted by your cards. And of course, one thing that the text also says, in contrast to maybe Ghost Rider, Bayo, or Tesla, if you ever reach 0 Psyche, well, you discard a random card and take damage equal to its boost value. That's, of course, insanely bad, because discarding random cards on its own is already bad, but taking damage equal to its boost value, ouch, that really hurts. So you want to avoid falling to 0 Psyche always. Like, if that happens, you're probably screwed. You can kind of ignore that if you're at the end of your turn or whenever you reach 0 Psyche are at 0 cards in hand. Then, of course, you cannot discard a card and cannot take damage. So there is a point where you can actually play around that, but usually that won't happen. And of course, the main way how you use how you lose Psyche is if you didn't attack. So that ability alone says you want to be quite aggressive. You want to attack almost every single turn, which is also why you have 3 1 health sidekicks. You get more board coverage, probably won't have to boost that much. But in some cases, you still are fine with losing 1 Psyche just because you have a total of 5. So if you're starting with 5, maybe in the first turn of the game, yeah, it's okay to double maneuver and just lose 1 because you still have enough. But of course, it will add up over time, so it will always be a tricky decision whether maybe you want to boost and lose a good card, or just not boost and take a second maneuver, or even play a scheme card and then lose the Psyche. So it's definitely pretty dynamic, and you basically have to make that decision of whether to attack or not attack on every single turn, which you usually already have, but this one, it's a bit more punishing if you don't attack. So yeah, that definitely marks this deck as a bit more of an aggressive playstyle, although you can still play a good value game. But enough bubbling about the cards. Let's just the ability. Let's jump into the cards. So first of all, we have a Prince 6 value attack for Lovecraft himself with a boost value of 3. You have 3 copies. It is Cthulhu Taggen. I love that name. Immediately lose 2 Psyche. If you reach 0 Psyche this way, ignore the random discard. So Prince 6 value attacks, of course, are insanely strong. We've seen them in Bigfoot's deck with Larger Than Life or Sweet Christmas from Luke. Just a blank Prince 6 is insanely strong. They will usually deal like 2 or even 3 damage, and if you get them over a feint, even 4, that's like insane output. And the immediately effect, well, you instantly lose 2 Psyche. That's not great, because with many of your cards, you at least have the option to lose it. But in this case, it can actually help you in some way, because if you reach 0, you ignore the random discard. So whenever you play this at 2 Psyche or lower, you just always reset to 2 Psyche. Oh, that's one thing I forgot to mention on the ability, because it doesn't show on the bottom. After you random discarded the card and went to 0, you just set your Psyche back to 2. Sorry for forgetting that. So if you're at 2 Psyche or lower, you will reach 0 and then just reset to 2. So in the case of playing this at 2 Psyche, it doesn't really do much. It just exists. You play blank 6 attack and it doesn't do anything. In the case where you're at 1 Psyche, you actually gain 1 by playing this card, because you lose 2, get to 0, but you ignore the random discard, and then just reset back to 2. So you basically gain 1. And I mean, you can't be at 0 Psyche, so yeah. So technically, you want to play this card ideally when you're at 2 psyche or lower, although you can play it with any amount. But in that case, it's always, of course, a bit punishing because you always lose 2. This effect can be feinted, and in some cases, the opponent actually wants to feint it. For example, if you're at 1 psyche and your opponent is suspecting this card to be played, maybe they want you to not get to 2 psyche back. In that case, they might take the risk and then just take 4 damage over the feint, but usually it's a bad idea to feint this card. But it's definitely a nice thing because at least the opponent is usually like fine with both outcomes. Either you played this at low psyche and they could kind of expect it because you're that low, because most of your cards require to spend psyche to have good effects, and when you attack with low psyche, well, it's probably a Cthulhu. So they can expect when the big attack is coming, then maybe value provoke quite well, or if you didn't play it on low psyche amount, you at least guarantee lose 2 without having the choice. So yeah, it definitely makes it a bit more dynamic and interesting than just having a print 6 that can punish the opponent at all times. But then let's get into the next one, which is a print 2 value attack for Lovecraft himself. Again, boost value of 3, you have 2 copies. It is the King in Yellow. And it says after combat you may spend 2 psyche to deal 3 damage to both fighters in the combat. Now, 3 auto damage just from one card is of course insanely strong. Maybe if we compare it to maybe Little Red's Once Upon a Time, that's pretty damn strong. The catch is you also take 3 damage yourself. Since only Lovecraft can play this card, you can't cheat around that by playing it with a Formless Shadow, who of course only has 1 health. So yeah, Lovecraft has to take 3 as well. So it's probably more comparable to some of the deal damage back cards like Skin Like Titanium from Luke Cage's deck, where you basically take the same damage as the opponent, just that this one is on attack. So usually those cards are a bit stronger when it's on defense, because you can maybe catch the opponent off guard and they end their turn with a lower health count than they thought they would have, and then double attack them to get a good lethal. But at the same time, this can also just be used as that, as a good lethal, maybe as like Blaze of Glory from Ghost Rider, where you just deal 5 to everyone and then win, because of course if you both die by playing this card, you as the attacker, because you were the active player, you win, even if you also went to 0 health or even technically lower. So it's a quite nice finisher, and it of course creates the mind game between Cthulhu and this at the end, because your opponent will want to feint this to avoid the lethal, but if they would die from 3 health, well, if the Cthulhu hits over a feint, that would be 4 damage, so they would also die, whereas they would want to value block Cthulhu to not take 3 damage. But then if you play this, you can still kill them. So that's definitely interesting. And in many cases, since you want to be the aggressor, still spending the 2 psyche to deal 3 to both fighters is still worth it, because, I mean, you have 16 health and a bit of healing, so you usually can tank that, and if you need some protection, you also have your 1 health sidekicks to put in the way, so your health is usually not that valuable, whereas the opponent's health will just steadily go down, and that will probably be good for you. So it's definitely a bit more of a situational card, and it has its drawbacks, but definitely still pretty strong, especially as a finisher. And then we got to a 5 value attack. Any, so the Formless Shadows can use it. With a boost value of 2, you have 2 copies. It is a nice cup of spiced tea. And it says immediately, if your opponent didn't defend, ignore the value of this card. And then after combat, gain 2 psyche. So, first of all, 5 value attacks technically are, of course, really strong. But for the rare case where the opponent decides not to defend, this is basically a 0, so it won't deal damage. So that's, of course, an insanely big punish. So usually you want to play this card whenever you're at a low psyche amount, of course, because you want to gain the 2 psyche, just like for max value. But at the same time, if you're maybe at 1 and you attack with this, your opponent might just take it, just for the chance of this being this card. And then, well, you don't deal them damage. You still get your 2 psyche, which is okay, I guess, but yeah, you don't deal damage, and that definitely feels sad. But that's again where also Mind Games with Cthulhu come back, because both of these cards you want to play when you're at low psyche amount. Just that this card can also be played with your Formless Shadows. So they have a bit of a mind game themselves, whereas maybe you don't want to defend against them, but as we'll see, they also have some scary things to throw at you. But I might say, if you're playing against Lovecraft, it is one of the most satisfying things on Earth if you take this card and don't take damage from a 5-value attack. It is so cool. Um, and so gaining the 2 Psyche is definitely quite nice. That's a total of 4 extra Psyche that you get. So yeah, you definitely have a bit more to spend. And it's definitely important because if you don't see these or don't get to play them, well, kind of sucks because you'll be stuck at low Psyche. Although you have a lot of tools to actually increase it, so it wouldn't be as bad. But still, really cool card. I just like the idea. And yeah, let's get to the next one, which is a 4-value versatile, any. So again, both the Formless Shadows and Lovecraft can play it. You have a boost value of 1 with 3 copies. It is the Black Pharaoh. And it says, after combat, you may spend any amount of Psyche to move each of your fighters up to as many spaces as the amount of Psyche you spend. You may move through opposing fighters. So 4-value versatiles are of course really, really good. They are max value blocks, as we like to call it in the competitive scene. And they're just good overall. Then the after combat effect also allows you to move away, so this can prevent double attacks. Or maybe you can move out of a pin because you can move through opposing fighters. But of course, you have to spend Psyche for it. So at least you get the choice of how much you want to spend. If you're maybe at a hard zone cutoff, you only want to spend one of them. Or since you can move all of your fighters by spending, you can maybe move Lovecraft one away and then move a shadow in the way so that the opponent maybe cannot attack Lovecraft anymore or whatever. Or maybe if it was the second action, you can move the shadow away if he played this card on defense and then move Lovecraft in for a surprise double attack. It's definitely quite versatile, but usually you don't want to spend more than 2 Psyche for this, because more movement will usually not be needed just because you have so many fighters. And if you play this on defense, I mean, 2 spaces of movement should be enough. But it's definitely a decent card overall. The shadows can also attack with it, so you have the idea where you can either attack with a print 5 that if you don't defend, it's a 0, or you could just take the 4 and then the 5 is still in the game. So yeah, there are again some mind games to be played, but overall it's just a really decent block card overall. And yeah, nothing wrong about it. You don't complain about a 4-value block that can move. And then we get to maybe my favorite card in the deck. It's a 3-value versatile any, again, so both Lovecraft and the Formless Shadows can play it. The boost value of 2, you have 3 copies, it is Reading the Necronomicon. And after combat, you may spend 2 Psyche to draw 3 cards. If you didn't, gain 1 Psyche. So this of course is a really big decision, because drawing 3 cards with losing 2 Psyche, or just doing nothing and gaining 1 Psyche is of course pretty different from each other. Usually, as I said, you want to be aggressive, and you don't actually have a lot of card draw except for this, and this is actually the only card draw that you have on combat cards, so it can be quite important just to get it. 2 Psyche is, it's mildly costly. I mean, if you're at 5, I think it works, and if you're lower, it can be quite bad because usually 2 Psyche, as we've also seen in the King in Yellow, is like the amount you need for your effects to actually trigger or be useful. So if you play it at like, I don't know, 4 Psyche and then you spend the 2, yeah, you had 2. So the next time you attack, if you spend your 2 Psyche, you'll have 0 and then, random discard something. So it can be quite costly, but at least if you don't decide to use the effect, you can gain 1 Psyche back because you kind of resist this dark and evil book. So you get 1 Psyche back. So again, that's another potential 3 extra that you have. So yeah, you're probably quite well equipped in that regard, but just spending that 2 to draw 3 can be a huge swing in hands. So maybe if you're both at 2 cards, you and your opponent, you play this on defense after they attack, they're at 1 card, you play this, you draw 3, so you're back at 4 and then can really pressure them. So your opponent is quite not incentivized to attack when they're at low hand count just because you could play this on defense and just get a huge hand swing and then unleash hell on them with maybe 2 Cthulhu's or whatever. But overall, it's a really fun card to play. And at least even if you don't have enough Psyche to spend, you can at least recover some. So it's probably my favorite card in the deck just because drawing 3 is just so insanely fun. But yeah. Let's get to the next one. It's another 2-value versatile. The first 2-value versatile. Any, so both Lovecraft and the Shadows can play it. You have a boost value of 2 and 2 copies. It is Strange Music. During combat, you may spend 2 psyche to ignore the value of your opponent's card. Now, ignoring values is of course very, very strong. We've seen that from maybe Impossible to See from Invisible Man, Little Red's eyes, what big eyes you have, or like, I don't know, basically bewilderment on defense. It's always really, really strong. But in this case, you have to spend your resources for it, and spending 2 psyche to ignore the value can be quite costly, because if we think you're attacking with this, yeah, you might ignore their 3 value block, their 4 value block, maybe even a 5 value block, but you spend 2 psyche to deal 2 damage. So that's 1 psyche per damage, whereas maybe if we take a look at something like the King in Yellow, you would spend 2 psyche to deal 3 damage instead. So it's a bit better than that, although on that card you also take self damage. So yeah, it's always kind of like thinking about, is it worth it? I think more so this card is often used on defense, because in that case it is still a 2 value block, which isn't that bad on its own. So if the opponent bait attacked into it, you don't have to spend. But if they maybe got their big swing, maybe a log, you can spend the 2 to like ignore the log and don't take damage at all, which is definitely a better trade. Or maybe even if you play this into beast form or whatever, it can be way better than that, because usually on offense it will only be 2 psyche for dealing 2 damage, whereas on defense it can be way better than that. And it can be quite a reliable tool if you want to like keep a shadow alive. But overall, it's just a decent card overall. I think it definitely depends on the matchup and when you play it, because it's quite costly, but just having the option to ignore values is definitely appreciated in any deck. And then this time we have another 2 value versatile any. Boost value of 1, 3 copies. Feint. Usual feint, cancel all effects on your opponent's card. We love to see a feint. It's just usual cancel. Having the option to cancel is always great. It's also good that it's an any, so the shadows can use it. So yeah, the opponent can't just farm effects on them. That's of course always appreciated. If there's like any strong effect the opponent would have, you can always kind of prevent it if you need to. I think in this deck, more so than in others, you actually offensive feint a lot more, because you want to be aggressive and attack a lot. So you want to guarantee double attack, so you maybe attack with feint first. Because you're at a high psyche count. Either the opponent feints themselves because they expected maybe something scary, maybe an Necronomicon or whatever, or they wanted to play a movement defense to get away and don't take damage. In both cases, playing a feint against that is pretty cool. Yeah, it's just nice to have the option of playing a feint in any deck to cancel effects. Always appreciate it. If you want to know more about what a genius card feint is, I would recommend Baked Goods guide about feint. I think it's like a whole hour just about this one card. So yeah, that's definitely cool. So you'll see why feint is such a great card. Well then, let's get into the block only cards. First off, we have a print 4 value block, any again, with a boost value of 2. It is a nice cup of black tea. After combat, gain 2 psyche. If you won the combat, shuffle 1 card from your discard pile back into your deck. So, first of all, 4 value blocks on their own, again, are really, really good. It's max value blocks, you don't complain about that on its own. You gain 2 psyche. That on its own is already a pretty nice effect, because as we've seen, 2 psyche can grant you some really nasty effects. You can translate that into draw 3 cards, or into ignore value, or into deal 3 damage, or whatever. So that's definitely pretty strong on its own. But then if you win the combat, you shuffle 1 card back into your deck, which is of course a really, really strong effect with recursion. Just due to your cards, since your cards are like insanely strong if you always spend the psyche, they're definitely ones that you want to recur more than others. But at the same time, you always have to think about it. If you maybe shuffle back another Cthulhu, that's another guaranteed 2 psyche that you'll actually lose. So you always have to kind of think about how many psyche gain effects you have left and what actually you want to recur at any given point. Maybe sometimes you'll just go for a Necronomicon because, I mean, it's just a decent option overall. Either you spend 2 and draw 3, which is of course really good for pressure, or you just gain 1 back. So that's like the middle in the road. Or you go for maybe a nice cup of spiced tea, which is just a decent attack overall, and it gains your psyche back. It's just really up to you. Now, winning with a 4 value blue on defense, I mean, it's doable, definitely. If the opponent somehow like kind of bait attacked or whatever, it's of course pretty likely to trigger. If you're playing against maybe someone like Little Red or whatever, who usually doesn't have high printed values or ways to bypass this, is of course stronger, and you should always think about at which point or against which fighter this card is most likely to trigger. Maybe if you're playing against Medusa, you know it will be guaranteed against any Harpy attack that's not feigned, which is definitely a valid valid strategy to play against this deck, where you just offensive feint and try to catch the black teas from recurring and gaining the psyche, because in the case where I don't gain psyche as Lovecraft, I also don't have many scary attacks, so just preventing that can be a viable strategy than just playing the feints against Lovecraft when he actually has a high psyche amount. Now you have 3 copies of this, so you're pretty likely to get at least one to recur something. Now you can recur itself if you already have a copy in discard pile, but that is always the caveat. This is only block card, so if we're talking fatigue-wise, you cannot really attack with it as a pass later, so it's actually not that strong. But it's quite nice to just keep the psyche chain up, kind of like Golden Bat recurses Alpines the whole time, just to have the constant movement. Whereas with this, you can recur itself just to always have like a good amount of psyche and still have the option to recur something later. Just when it gets into the end game, recurring itself will probably not be the right idea because you, like I said, cannot attack. So maybe getting something else that's just a decent option overall. Maybe a king in yellow to finish the job, or a Cthulhu or whatever will be a better idea. But yeah, it's just definitely a threat. It usually prevents your opponent from bait attacking you too much, because they of course don't want you to increase your deck size, and since you're the aggressor, you'll have to boost a bit usually after your shadows are dead. So yeah, you'll lose value with this, kind of you can get it back, but it's definitely a scary card, and just a decent block overall, even if it doesn't trigger, and since it always gains the 2 psyche, it's probably one of your best cards. And oh yeah, and one thing I forgot to mention, your shadows can block with it. So usually the opponent wants to play low things into 1 health sidekicks just to get rid of them and don't lose too much value. But since you can block with black tea with the shadows, they're maybe not as incentivized to do as much and maybe spend actual resources on the shadows, and in which case you're probably happy. If you didn't defend, maybe they used one of their big attacks on a 1 health sidekick and you didn't defend, which is of course pretty good. But now, next blue card, it's a 3-value block. Any again with a boost value of 3 this time. You have 2 copies. It's the Mountains of Madness. Now, during combat, you may spend any amount of psyche. Increase the value of this card by the amount of psyche you spend. Now, 3-value blocks on their own are already average block value, but this of course can be way higher than that. Technically, you have a max of 5 psyche. You don't really want to spend the 5th one because then you would have to random discard. So usually the max this can be is a 7-value block if you spend 4 psyche, which of course is an insanely good block. But at the same time, it's kind of equal to Strange Music, whereas Strange Music basically spends 1 psyche to deal 1 damage. This spends 1 psyche to prevent 1 damage. So it can of course be nice to have that insanely high block available, but usually you don't spend more than 1 just to get this up to 4, maybe to prevent a certain winning combat effect. Or just like maybe to prevent your fighter from dying, because if the opponent attacked with a 5 or something, it's probably not worth just to spend the 2 psyche to prevent the 2 damage. You just have way better effects to do with your psyche. But at the same time, it's pretty nice to have the option, and it of course can prevent some lethal thresholds. Maybe if Dracula is playing a beast form and he thinks he has 1, then you can play this as a 7-value block, and it's quite cool. But overall, if you want to go for a safer option on defense, I think Strange Music is always better. But it's still a decent card. I mean, since you can choose how much psyche you spend after you see the opponent's card, that's always great to see. You can always adjust it depending on the situation, how much psyche you have right now, which fighter is attacked, how much health you have, what is in your hand, what you plan to do on your turn after that. So yeah, it's just a decent card overall. Not one of the best, probably like good thing to boost with because it's a boost 3. If you want to reach that far, it's definitely one of the candidates to do so. But yeah, it's still a decent card overall. And then we get to the only shadow only card in the deck, which is a 2-value attack for the shadows with a boost value of 3. You have 3 copies. It has claws! Ooh. After combat, deal 2 damage to an adjacent opposing fighter. Now, this again, of course, brings up the mind game between this and a nice cup of spiced tea, whereas they want to take spiced tea if it's coming from the shadows usually, because shadows like don't have print sixes, so you can't be punished that much. But at the same time, it could also be this card, and if they don't defend, well, it's 2 damage normally, and since you're attacking, you usually will be adjacent to the opposing fighter. So yeah, that would be another 2 damage, and that's basically 4 undefended damage. Um, this of course also, if they like maybe it's expected a spice tea to come, but weren't sure and just defended pretty high, maybe with a 4 value block. This will still deal the 2 damage to the opposing fighter if they are still adjacent. So it can be quite a nice punish against good blocks, so it can be a pretty good bait attack, but at the same time, it also has like many drawbacks. Of course, if the opponent feints, it's just 0 damage because the effect will just be ignored. And yeah, I mean, feint is a 2-value versatile, so no damage. If the opponent played any type of movement effect on defense, well, they will also hop away from the 2 damage, so that's also not great. Or if they had any type of ping effect, maybe wily fighting, the shadow will actually die before he can deal the 2 damage. So it definitely has its counters. I think the opponent is always incentivized to play like a mid-value block against the shadows just to not get punished either by T or this. But that as well also at least means that you usually deal a bit of damage whenever they attack. And I mean, it's a 3 boost value, so yeah, you can boost with it. This card, of course, is not really a reason to keep the shadows around, but I think more so why you want them is because you want to attack every turn, and since you have way more bodies when your one of sidekicks are there, it's way easier for you to reach. You don't have to boost that often, and they can also attack because you don't have to attack with Lovecraft himself. In order to not lose Psyche, the shadows can also attack. It just refers to you as a player, so yeah. They're definitely quite important for him, but not that you definitely have to keep them around. This card is just okay overall. In the case where you get the 2 auto damages, of course, really, really good. And I mean, it again creates some mind games for the shadows with Spice Tea, so yeah, pretty nice to have it. And then we get into the last cards, which are the schemes. First of all, you have an any scheme with 2 copies and a boost value of 2. It is a nice cup of green tea. It says gain 2 psyche, move each of your fighters up to 3 spaces. You may move through opposing fighters, gain 1 action. So, as you've seen, the T's in this deck always are the cards that gain you psyche usually, aside from the Necronomicon. So just gaining 2 Psyche on a scheme instantly is quite nice. Maybe your opponent attacked you last turn, you had to spend 2 Psyche, now you're at 1, so they felt quite comfortable that you don't have that many scary effects. Now you play this as first action, bam, go up to 3, and now basically all your spent 2 Psyche effects are back online to catch your opponent off guard. That can be quite nice. Also, just the moving 3 spaces is always appreciated as a move to a melee fighter because it just helps you to close the gap between you and the opponent without actually having to boost. And then you can move through opposing fighters, so it's quite nice to get behind maybe 1 health sidekick walls or to escape a pin or whatever. And then gaining the action, of course, is quite nice for creating double attack opportunities. And just gaining 2 psyche before that also kind of usually ensures that you have enough psyche to actually attack twice and still play decent effects. So yeah, it's just a good card overall. Gaining the 2 psyche is always appreciated, and other than that, it's just pretty basic scheme, but always appreciated. With the movement, you're always happy when you don't have to boost as a move to melee fighter. So yeah, decent card overall. And then the last one, it's another scheme. This time for Lovecraft only. Boost value of 1, 2 copies. It's the Miskatonic University. Lovecraft recovers 2 health, then choose 1. Either draw 2 cards or return a defeated formless shadow to any space in Lovecraft's zone. Now, just recovering 2 health on a scheme on its own is pretty nice. Then you get the option. This is quite interesting. It always kind of tells what you're trying to do in any specific game, because if you want to draw the 2 cards, that's of course quite nice, because this is your only other card draw next to Necronomicon, and this of course doesn't rely on you having Psyche, so that can be quite good. Just like to refill your hand, maybe if you got pressured, or if you want to plan or if you're planning to pressure even more. But at the same time, if you play this to draw, you usually have to maneuver second action if you didn't already attack as first action or if the opponent ended adjacent. So you can't just attack after you played this card, which of course means you will lose one psyche at the end of your turn because you didn't attack. So that can be quite costly. But the second option is to return a formless shadow to any space in Lovecraft zone. Now, this of course is quite nice because more one-health sidekicks means you have more bodies on the board, you have more board control, you'll have to boost less. You also technically, if your opponent is like maybe 3 or 4 spaces away, you can play this, place a formless shadow next to them if they're still in their zone, then surprise attack them. That can happen. Or it's just good to have another body on the board that the opponent has to go through to get the Lovecraft. And maybe you take the attack and then they basically waste an additional card for that. And it, of course, can be a pass if you return the shadow. So technically, if you recur Miskatonic with all 3 black teas, you can have a total of 5 passes that always heal 2. And you can technically have, 5 additional 1-health sidekicks, so a total of 8. That will usually never happen because you have way better cards to recur. And since Necronomicon is your only other draw in the deck, sometimes you really rely on just drawing the 2 cards instead of returning the shadow. It always depends on the situation and how your psyche management is going on. But it's definitely an interesting card to show. And just recovering 2 health is always great. It again, of course, leads to you being quite tanky, so playing something like the King in Yellow won't be as costly if you're at 20 health in total. So yeah, that would be Lovecraft's deck. He overall is just really cool. All of his cards are pretty damn strong if you actually manage to play them in the right situation with the right amount of psyche. It's definitely one of the more like interesting and like consistent resource managed decks, kind of similar to Tesla, whereas you don't like to be pressured as much because, well, in that case you'll have to spend a lot of psyche on defense and then maybe you run away, and then since you didn't attack, you also lose another psyche at the end of your turn. But whereas if you get maybe a good Necronomicon, draw 3, then you can push the aggression, then actually spend your psyche in a way that you want it to, and yeah. And it's not like Ghost Rider where you just rely on 4 cards on your deck to basically get your fuel. You have like a pretty good spread, and it just depends on how you actually use your psyche and position well to not having to boost and to be able to attack every turn. And yeah, it's definitely a really cool deck. I really enjoyed to play it, and I would definitely recommend you to check it out if you like your resource management fighters, like maybe Tesla or Ghost Rider. That still, however, play like a kind of normal game, so not like Ghost Rider who's just rooming and not really interacting with the opponent. So yeah, give it a try. I definitely recommend it. It's really, really fun to play. But yeah, that would be it for today. Probably, maybe I'll post a second one as well. We'll see. But yeah, until next time. Bye bye.